During a trip with his security guard, the millionaire was paralyzed when he saw his watch, the same one his son was wearing before he disappeared. Alejandro Morales watched the cityscape from his office window. At 65, he was one of Latin America's most successful businessmen, with an empire that spanned several sectors. However, behind his facade of success and wealth, there was a man tormented by a loss that had consumed him for 2 decades. His brown eyes, marked by deep wrinkles, reflected a sadness that time had failed to erase. 20 years had passed since his son, Mateo, mysteriously disappeared. The boy was only 8 years old when he vanished without a trace, leaving a void that no amount of business success could fill. Alejandro sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. He was about to set off on another business trip, another attempt to fill the void in his life with incessant work. He picked up his Italian leather briefcase and left the office, heading for the elevator. In the lobby of the building, Carlos, his personal bodyguard for over a decade, was waiting for him. Tall, muscular, and always alert, Carlos was more than just a security guard. He was Alejandro's constant shadow, his protector and, in a way, his only confidant. "Good evening, Mr. Morales," Carlos greeted with a slight nod. "The car is ready to take you to the airport." Alejandro nodded and walked towards the exit. It was then that something caught his eye. A glint of metal on Carlos's wrist caught his eye, making him stop abruptly. "Carlos," said Alejandro, his voice trembling slightly. "That watch—" The bodyguard looked at his wrist, confused. "Yes, sir?" Alejandro approached, his eyes fixed on the watch. It was an old model, with a worn brown leather strap and a gold dial. But it wasn't the watch's appearance that disturbed him. It was the uncanny resemblance to the watch Mateo had been wearing on the day of his disappearance. "Where did you get it?" asked Alejandro, his voice barely disguising the urgency he felt. Carlos, noticing the sudden change in his boss's demeanor, answered cautiously. "I bought it in a pawn shop a few months ago, sir. I like old watches, and this one caught my eye." Alejandro felt his heart race. After 20 years without a clue, without any hope, here was something that could be a connection to his lost son. "Carlos," he said, his voice now firm and determined, "change of plans, cancel my trip. I want you to take me to this pawn shop, now." The bodyguard hesitated for a moment, surprised by the sudden change of plans, but years of loyal service made him agree immediately. "Of course, Mr. Morales. I'll make the necessary arrangements." While Carlos made a few quick calls, Alejandro couldn't take his eyes off the clock. It was as if time had stopped at that moment, bringing back all the memories, all the emotions he had tried to bury for 2 decades. Minutes later, they were in the car, driving through the bustling streets of Buenos Aires. Alejandro looked out of the window, but his mind was far away, recalling the fateful day Mateo disappeared. The park where they played, the boy's beaming smile, the moment of distraction that changed everything. The drive to the pawn shop was silent, with Carlos casting worried glances at his boss through the rearview mirror. He had never seen Alejandro so agitated, so focused. It was as if a long-extinguished flame had been rekindled. Finally, they came to a narrow street in the San Telmo district, known for its antique stores and pawn shops. The store in question was small and poorly lit, with a dusty window displaying a variety of antique objects. Alejandro got out of the car before Carlos could even open the door for him. The bodyguard hurried to accompany him, always aware of his surroundings, doing his duty to protect the businessman. The doorbell jingled as they entered. Inside the store was a maze of shelves crammed with various objects: old watches, jewelry, dusty books, and trinkets from all eras. An elderly man with thick glasses and unkempt white hair looked up from a ledger. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Alejandro approached the counter, his intense gaze fixed on the old shopkeeper. "This man," he said, pointing at Carlos, "bought a watch here a few months ago. I need to know where it came from." The old man frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the direct approach. "Sir, we have a lot of customers and—" Alejandro interrupted, placing a considerable amount of money on the counter. "Please, it's very important. This watch could be the key to finding my missing son." The shopkeeper looked at the money, then at Alejandro's desperate face, and finally at Carlos, who nodded silently. Sighing, the old man picked up a large ledger and began to leaf through it. "Ah, yes," he muttered after a few minutes. "Here it is." The watch was sold by a man called Miguel Sanchez. He said he found it in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. Alejandro felt a shiver run down his spine. An abandoned house. Could his son have been there? Could he still be alive? "I need the address of that house," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. The shopkeeper hesitated again, but Alejandro's determined gaze and Carlos's intimidating presence convinced him. Scribbling an address on a piece of paper, he handed it to Alejandro. "Thank you," said the businessman, guarding the paper as if it were a treasure. "You have no idea what this means to me." As they left the store, Alejandro turned to Carlos, his eyes shining with a mixture of hope and fear. "We need to go to this house, Carlos. Now." The bodyguard nodded, his expression serious. "Sir, as your security officer, I must warn you that it could be dangerous. Let me make an assessment first, or call for reinforcements." But Alejandro was already heading for the car. "There's no time, Carlos. Every minute counts. Let's go together. I trust in your abilities to keep us safe." Reluctant but loyal, Carlos agreed. As they drove towards the address provided, he couldn't help feeling that they were on the verge of something big, something that would change their lives forever. Night fell over Buenos Aires as they left the city limits and entered a more rural area. The road became increasingly narrow and bumpy, plunging into the darkness of the Argentine night. Finally, after almost an hour's drive, they arrived at an abandoned property. The once imposing house was now in ruins, with broken windows and peeling paint. A sinister atmosphere hung over the place, as if it held dark secrets. Alejandro got out of the car, his eyes fixed on the ruined house. 20 years of repressed emotions were threatening to spill over. Carlos quickly positioned himself next to him, one hand discreetly on his gun. "Sir," said Carlos, his voice low and tense, "please allow me to enter first to make sure it's safe." Alejandro nodded silently, his heart beating so loudly that he could hear it. As Carlos moved cautiously towards the house, Alejandro couldn't help but think of Mateo. Had his son been in this dark place? What had happened to him? Carlos returned a few minutes later, looking tense but not alarmed. "The house seems to be empty, Mr. Morales, but there are signs that someone has been here recently. We should proceed with extreme caution." Together they entered the house. The interior was in ruins, with broken furniture and papers strewn across the floor. The air was heavy with the smell of mold and abandonment. Alejandro and Carlos began to search the place, looking for anything that might be a clue. It was then that Alejandro noticed something glowing faintly under a pile of dusty papers. With trembling hands, he pulled the papers apart, revealing a small metal box. Inside, he found a series of old documents and faded photographs. His heart almost stopped when his eyes landed on one of the photos. It was Mateo, older than the last time he had seen him, but unmistakably his son. "Carlos," he called, his voice breaking. "Look at this." The bodyguard approached, his eyes widening at the sight of the photograph. "Mr. Morales, this is—" "Yes," Alejandro replied, tears starting to form in his eyes. "It's Mateo. He was here, Carlos. My son was here." As they examined the other documents, a terrible reality began to dawn on them. The papers revealed details of a child trafficking network, with names, dates, and places. Among the documents, they found a letter mentioning Mateo's name and a woman called Elena. The letter talked about transferring the boy to an orphanage in Italy. Alejandro felt as if the world was spinning around him. His son, his precious Mateo, had been the victim of a criminal network. But he was alive. Somewhere in Italy, his son was alive. "Carlos," said Alejandro, his voice now firm and determined, "we need to go to Italy. Let's find that orphanage and find out what happened to Mateo." The bodyguard nodded, his expression serious. "I'll be by your side every step of the way, Mr. Morales." As they left the abandoned house, taking with them the documents they had found, Alejandro felt something he hadn't felt for a long time. Hope. The search for his lost son, dormant for so long, had been rekindled. The Argentine night enveloped them as they headed back to the city, ready to begin a journey that would take them beyond the country's borders in search of long-awaited answers. Little did they know that this would only be the first stage of an odyssey that would test not only their determination, but also their courage, loyalty, and above all, the power of a father's love for his son. The rising sun painted the Buenos Aires sky in shades of orange and pink as Alejandro and Carlos boarded the private jet, bound for Italy. The last 48 hours had been a whirlwind of emotions and frantic preparations. Alejandro had barely been able to sleep, his mind filled with images of Matteo and unanswered questions. During the flight, Alejandro kept rereading the documents found in the abandoned house. Every word, every name was a piece of the puzzle he had been trying to put together for 2 decades. Carlos, ever vigilant, watched his boss with a mixture of concern and admiration. "Mr. Morales," said Carlos, breaking the silence after hours of flying, "if I may ask, what exactly are we looking for in Italy?" Alejandro looked up from his papers, his gaze distant. "Answers, Carlos. And God willing, my son." Arriving in Rome, they checked into a discreet hotel away from prying eyes. Alejandro immediately started making calls, using his contacts and resources to track down the orphanage mentioned in the documents. After 2 days of intense searching, they finally got a concrete lead. The orphanage, located on the outskirts of Florence, was still in operation. Without wasting any time, they set off. The Santa Maria della Speranza Institute was an imposing 19th-century building surrounded by manicured gardens. Despite its welcoming appearance, Alejandro felt a chill run down his spine as he approached. What would they discover there? They were greeted by the director, Sister Lucia, a middle-aged woman with kind but cautious eyes. Alejandro explained their situation, showing them Matteo's photo and the documents they had found. Sister Lucia's expression changed from caution to shock, then to deep sadness. "Mr. Morales," she said softly, "I remember the boy you're talking about. He arrived here almost 20 years ago, frightened and confused. We called him Lorenzo." Alejandro felt his heart squeeze. "Lorenzo," he repeated, savoring the name of his lost son. "What happened to him?" Sister Lucia hesitated, glancing nervously at Carlos, who remained silent but alert. "Lorenzo was adopted by a wealthy Italian family just a few months after he arrived here, the Bianchi. They took him north to Milan." The news hit Alejandro like a punch. His son, so close and yet so far away. "I need to find him," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "Please tell me you have some information about this family." The nun shook her head sadly. "I'm sorry, but we don't keep in touch with adoptive families after the process has been completed. It would be a violation of their privacy." Alejandro felt frustration growing inside him. They had come so far only to find another dead end. It was then that Carlos stepped forward. "Sister," he said respectfully, "we understand the importance of privacy, but we're talking about a child who has been taken from his family. Please, any information, no matter how small, can help us reunite a father with his child." Sister Lucia looked at the two men, seeing the pain and determination in their eyes. Finally, with a sigh, she nodded. "I'll see what I can find in our old archives, but I can't promise anything." While they waited, Alejandro walked the corridors of the orphanage, imagining his son, now called Lorenzo, walking those same corridors, sleeping in one of the rooms, playing in the gardens. The pain of separation, dormant for so many years, returned in full force. After what seemed like an eternity, Sister Lucia returned with a yellowed briefcase. "This is all I have," she said, handing the folder to Alejandro. "The Bianchi's last known address in Milan and some photos of Lorenzo during his time here." With trembling hands, Alejandro opened the folder. Tears welled up in his eyes as he saw the photos of his son, now a little older, smiling shyly at the camera. Carlos placed a comforting hand on his boss's shoulder. "Thank you," Alejandro whispered to the nun. "You have no idea what this means to me." Leaving the orphanage, Alejandro and Carlos immediately set off for Milan. The search was far from over, but now they had a clear direction. During the car journey, Alejandro couldn't take his eyes off the photos of Lorenzo. "He looks happy," he muttered. Carlos, driving, cast a sidelong glance at his boss. "That's good, isn't it, sir? It means he's been well looked after." Alejandro nodded slowly. "Yes, it's good, but I can't help thinking about all the moments I've missed. His first steps at school, his birthdays, his achievements. The rest of the journey passed in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. When they arrived in Milan, it was late at night. They decided to stay in a hotel and start the search for the Bianchi family the next morning. That night, while Carlos made the usual security preparations, Alejandro lay awake, looking out of the hotel window at the city lights. Somewhere out there, perhaps a few kilometers away, was his son. A son who didn't know him, who probably didn't even know he was adopted. What would the reunion be like? Would Lorenzo accept him? And how would the Bianchi family react? 1,000 scenarios ran through Alejandro's head, some hopeful, others terrifying. The next morning, they began their search. The address provided by the orphanage was an elegant mansion in the suburbs of Milan. However, when they got there, they discovered that the Bianchi had moved out years ago. Undeterred, Alejandro used all his resources and contacts to track down the family. After days of intense searching, they finally got a clue. The Bianchi had moved to Venice. The story isn't over yet, but if you've watched this far, it's because you're enjoying it. So please consider subscribing to the channel and commenting on where you live. Getting back to the story, without wasting any time, they set off for the city of canals. Alejandro's anxiety grew with every kilometer he traveled. He was so close to meeting his son again, and at the same time he was afraid of what he might discover. When they arrived in Venice, a city that seemed to float on water, Alejandro felt like he was entering a dream. The narrow streets, the meandering canals, the ancient palaces, everything seemed unreal. With the help of a local detective, they managed to locate the Bianchi's current residence. It was an 18th century mansion overlooking the Grand Canal. Alejandro felt his heart race as he approached the ornate gate. Carlos, always attentive, noticed his boss's hesitation. "Mr. Morales," he said softly, "are you ready for this?" Alejandro took a deep breath, gathering all his courage. "I have to be, Carlos. I've been waiting for this moment for 20 years. With trembling hands, Alejandro rang the doorbell. The seconds seemed to drag by as they waited. Finally, the door opened, revealing an elegant, middle-aged woman. "Yes?" she asked, looking curiously at the two men. Alejandro swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. "Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Alejandro Morales. I'm looking for Lorenzo Bianchi. It's about a matter of extreme importance." The woman frowned, confused. "Lorenzo? I'm sorry, but I think there must be some mistake. I don't know anyone by that name." The world seemed to revolve around Alejandro. Had he come so far only to find another dead end? But before he could answer, a male voice came from inside the house. "Who is it, dear?" A man appeared next to the woman, and Alejandro felt his heart stop. There in front of him was the living image of Matteo, now a man of almost 30, but with the same eyes, the same smile that Alejandro had seen in his dreams for 2 decades. The young man looked at Alejandro, an expression of confusion on his face. "Can I help you, sir?" Alejandro opened his mouth, but no sound came out. How to explain, how to tell this young man that his whole life was about to change? It was Carlos who broke the tense silence. "Sir," he said gently to the young man, "I believe we have a long story to tell. Could we come in?" The couple exchanged apprehensive glances, but something in Alejandro's expression, a mixture of hope, fear, and love, made them agree. As they entered the house, Alejandro knew he was about to embark on the most important conversation of his life. The past, present, and future were about to collide, and nothing would be the same after that. The Bianchi's living room was elegant, with antique furniture and Renaissance paintings adorning the walls. Alejandro, Carlos, the young man who was the image of Matteo, and the Bianchi couple sat down, a tense silence hanging in the air. "So," began the older man, who introduced himself as Giorgio Bianchi, "what's this all about?" Alejandro took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the young man's face. "My name is Alejandro Morales. 20 years ago, my son Matteo was kidnapped in Buenos Aires, and I know you're him." The shock was visible on everyone's face. The young man, who until then had been called Lorenzo, visibly paled. "What? That can't be true," he stammered, looking at the Bianchi for answers. Chiara Bianchi, the woman who had welcomed them, put her hand to her mouth, tears forming in her eyes. "Giorgio, what's going on?" Giorgio Bianchi seemed to have aged 10 years in a few seconds. "Lorenzo, or Matteo, we didn't know. When we adopted you, we were told you were an orphan." Alejandro quickly intervened, his voice laced with emotion. "Please don't think I'm here to accuse you of anything. You took care of my son when I couldn't. I just wanted to find him." Lorenzo Matteo stood up abruptly, his hands shaking. "I need some air," he said, quickly leaving the room. Chiara tried to follow him, but Giorgio stopped her. "Give him a moment, darling. This is a shock for all of us." Alejandro felt his heart break again. He had imagined this moment for so long, but the reality was far more complicated and painful than any scenario he could have anticipated. Carlos, who had remained silent until then, spoke softly. "Mr. and Mrs. Bianchi, we understand that this is an extremely delicate situation. Mr. Morales has no intention of disrupting the life you have built. He just wants the chance to meet your son." Giorgio nodded slowly. "I understand, but Lorenzo, or Matteo, is our son too. We raised him, we love him. That can't simply be erased." "I know," said Alejandro, tears streaming down his face. "And I'm eternally grateful to you for taking care of him. I just ask for the chance to be part of his life too." Just then, Lorenzo Matteo came back into the room, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "I heard everything," he said, "and I don't know what to think. My whole life, and was it a lie?" Chiara stood up and hugged her son. "No, darling, our love for you has never been a lie." Alejandro approached cautiously. "Matteo, or Lorenzo if you prefer. I know this comes as a shock. I don't expect you to immediately accept me as your father. I'm just asking for the chance to get to know you, to be part of your life in some way." Lorenzo Matteo looked at Alejandro, really seeing him for the first time. I need time to process all this. But maybe we can talk, little by little." Alejandro nodded, a shaky smile on his lips. "That's all I ask." In the weeks that followed, Alejandro remained in Venice, having careful and emotional conversations with Lorenzo, Matteo, and the Bianchi. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. They discovered that Matteo's kidnapping had been orchestrated by an international child trafficking network. The Bianchi, who were unable to have children of their own, had adopted the boy in good faith, believing that he really was an orphan. With the help of Carlos and private investigators, they began to unravel the web of lies and crimes that had separated Matteo from his biological family. Each revelation brought a mixture of relief and pain as the truth came to light. Lorenzo, Matteo, initially reluctant, began to open up to Alejandro. They shared stories, photos, and memories. The young man discovered a part of himself that he didn't know existed, a heritage and a history that went beyond the Bianchi. A month after their initial reunion, Lorenzo Matteo made a decision. He brought Alejandro and the Bianchi together in the living room. "I've thought a lot about all this," he began, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion, "and I've come to the conclusion that I'm incredibly lucky. Many people spend their whole lives looking for love and family, and I have 2 fathers and 2 mothers who love me." Silent tears streamed down the faces of everyone in the room. "I don't want to choose between you," he continued. "I want you all to be part of my life, and—" He hesitated for a moment. "I'd like to be called Matteo Lorenzo, to honor both parts of my story." Alejandro couldn't hold back a sob of joy and relief. The Bianchis, although teary-eyed, smiled with understanding. "Son," said Giorgio, "your happiness is all that matters to us. If that means sharing you with Alejandro, then so be it." That evening, as the newly expanded family dined together, planning for the future and healing the wounds of the past, Alejandro couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey that had brought him here. He looked at Carlos, his faithful bodyguard and friend, who was watching the scene with a discreet smile. "Thank you," Alejandro murmured to Carlos. "I couldn't have done it without you." Carlos nodded respectfully. "I'll always be by your side, Mr. Morales, in every battle." As the night wore on and the laughter echoed through the house, Alejandro felt, for the first time in 20 years, that he was complete. The search was over, but a new journey was just beginning. A journey of healing, reconciliation, and above all, love. But even in this moment of joy, Alejandro couldn't ignore the shadow that loomed in the corners of his mind. The child trafficking network that had stolen his son was still out there, destroying other families. And he knew, looking at his newly found son and his loyal bodyguard, that his next mission had only just begun. The fight for justice and the protection of other innocent children would be his new crusade. And with his reunited and expanded family by his side, Alejandro felt ready to face any challenge the future might bring. In the months that followed the emotional reunion in Venice, Alejandro divided his time between reconnecting with Matteo Lorenzo and investigating the child trafficking ring that had separated his family for so long. With the tireless help of Carlos and a team of private investigators, they began to unearth a complex web of crimes that stretched across several countries. One day, while Alejandro was going over some documents in his temporary office in Venice, Carlos walked in with a serious expression. "Mr. Morales," he said, "we've found something big." Alejandro looked up, immediately alert. "What is it, Carlos?" Carlos put a folder on the table. "We've managed to track down one of the network's main operators, a woman called Sofia Vasquez, and sir, she has a connection to your family." With trembling hands, Alejandro opened the folder. His face paled when he saw the photo of a woman he knew very well. "It can't be Sofia, my ex-wife." Carlos nodded somberly. "It looks like she was involved in Matteo's disappearance from the start. For money." The revelation hit Alejandro like a punch in the gut. Sofia, the woman he had married after Matteo's mother died, the woman who had comforted him for years after the boy's disappearance, had been responsible for everything? "We need to tell Matteo," said Alejandro, his voice shaking with anger and pain. The conversation with Matteo Lorenzo was difficult. The young man, who was already dealing with so many revelations about his past, was devastated to learn that his stepmother had orchestrated his kidnapping. "Why?" he asked, tears in his eyes. "Why would she do that?" Alejandro hugged his son, feeling the weight of his guilt. "I'm sorry, son. I should have known. I should have protected you." But Matteo Lorenzo, showing a strength that surprised everyone, pulled away and looked into his father's eyes. "It wasn't your fault, Dad. It was hers. And now we're going to get justice." With renewed determination, Alejandro, Matteo Lorenzo and Carlos began planning how to confront Sofia and dismantle the trafficking network. The Bianchi, wanting to help, offered their resources and connections in Italy. Weeks of careful planning followed. Investigators were hired, authorities from various countries were contacted discreetly, and a complex operation began to take shape. Finally, the day of the confrontation arrived. Sofia had been located in a luxurious villa on the outskirts of Milan. Alejandro, accompanied by Carlos and a team of highly trained security guards, was preparing to confront her. Matteo Lorenzo insisted on going along, despite Alejandro's initial objections. "She stole my childhood," he said firmly. "I need to be there when she's caught." When they arrived at the villa, they found Sofia preparing to flee. She froze when she saw Alejandro and Matteo Lorenzo together. "It's over, Sofia," said Alejandro, his voice as cold as ice. "We know everything." Sofia tried to deny it, but faced with the evidence presented by Carlos, she collapsed. Between tears and recriminations, she confessed her involvement in Matteo's kidnapping and in dozens of other cases. As the authorities led Sofia away, Matteo Lorenzo turned to Alejandro, his eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and determination. "This can't happen to anyone else, Dad. Have to do something," Alejandro nodded. "You're right, Matteo, and we will." In the days that followed, as the investigation into the trafficking network deepened, Alejandro made a decision that would change the course of his life. With the support of Matteo Lorenzo, the Bianchis and Carlos, he decided to use his wealth and influence to create a foundation dedicated to combating child trafficking and reuniting separated families. The Morales Bianchi Foundation was born with the mission of not only rescuing trafficked children, but also providing psychological support and resources for families affected by this heinous crime. Alejandro knew that the road ahead would be difficult. Dismantling an international network of criminals would not be easy, and there would be dangers around every corner. But looking at his son, Carlos, and his extended family, he knew he was not alone in this fight. As they prepared for the Foundation's first official operation, Alejandro reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him there. From a desperate father to a man on a mission, he had found not only his son, but also a greater purpose. Night fell over Venice, and Alejandro watched the lights of the city reflected in the water of the canals. Tomorrow, they would embark on a new adventure, facing unknown dangers. But for the first time in decades, Alejandro felt truly alive, ready to face any challenge that fate might throw his way. With Matteo Lorenzo by his side and Carlos vigilant as ever, Alejandro knew that this was just the beginning of a new and exciting chapter in their lives, a story of redemption, justice, and, above all, the unbreakable power of family love. The following months were a whirlwind of activity for Alejandro, Matteo Lorenzo, and the entire team at the newly formed Morales Bianchi Foundation. With the dismantling of Sofia's network, a Pandora's box of information about child trafficking operations across Europe and South America was opened. The foundation quickly gained notoriety for its successful rescue operations and its commitment to providing comprehensive support to victims and their families. Alejandro, with his business experience, led the strategic and financial side, while Matteo Lorenzo, having studied psychology, coordinated the psychological support programs. Carlos, for his part, had become much more than just a bodyguard. His experience in security and his unwavering loyalty made him the Foundation's head of operations, overseeing the most dangerous rescue missions. One afternoon, while going over the details of an upcoming operation at the Foundation's office in Rome, Alejandro noticed the tiredness in his son's eyes. "Matteo," he said softly, "are you okay? You look exhausted." Matteo Lorenzo sighed, rubbing his eyes. "It's hard, Dad. Every child we rescue reminds me of what I've been through, but it also gives me the strength to carry on." Alejandro hugged his son, feeling a mixture of pride and concern. "You're stronger than I could ever have imagined, son. But remember, we can't help others if we don't take care of ourselves." At that moment, Carlos entered the room, his expression serious. "Gentlemen, we have a situation. We've received information about a major trafficking operation in Colombia. It seems to be one of the biggest networks we've ever faced." Alejandro and Matteo Lorenzo exchanged glances. They knew that this could be their most dangerous mission yet. "What are the risks, Carlos?" asked Alejandro. "High," replied Carlos bluntly. "The network has connections with local drug cartels. A joint operation with the Colombian authorities will be necessary." Matteo Lorenzo stood up, determination shining in his eyes. "We have to go. These children need us." Alejandro nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and apprehension. "Get everything ready, Carlos. We leave in 48 hours. The next few days were filled with intense preparation. Equipment was checked, plans were drawn up and retraced, and the team was carefully selected. The Bianchis, although worried, offered all the support they could from Italy. The day before the start, Alejandro found Matteo Lorenzo on the hotel balcony, looking out at the lights of Rome. "Nervous?" asked Alejandro, joining his son. Matteo Lorenzo smiled slightly. "A little, but more determined than ever." Alejandro put his hand on his son's shoulder. "You know, when I lost you all those years ago, I thought my life was over. Now, looking at you, at everything we've built together, I never imagined that we could turn our pain into something so powerful." "We're stronger together, Dad," replied Matteo Lorenzo, hugging Alejandro. The next morning, the team boarded a private jet to Colombia. The flight was tense, each team member immersed in their own thoughts and preparations. When they arrived in Bogotá, they were met by a contingent of Colombian police and international agents. The operation would be complex, involving multiple teams in different locations. Carlos, always efficient, coordinated the last details with the local authorities. "Remember," he told the team, "our priority is the children. We're not heroes, we're rescuers." As night fell over the city, the teams moved into position. Alejandro, Matteo Lorenzo, and Carlos led one of the main groups, heading for a compound on the outskirts of the city that was believed to be the center of the trafficking operation. Alejandro's heart was pounding as he watched the agents silently approach the compound. He knew that every second counted, that every move could mean the difference between success and failure. Suddenly, the silence of the night was broken by shouts and gunfire. The operation had begun. "Let's go," shouted Carlos, leading Alejandro and Matteo Lorenzo into the complex. The chaos that followed was a blur of movement and sound. Agents ran back and forth, children cried, and drug traffickers desperately tried to escape. In the midst of the confusion, Matteo Lorenzo spotted a group of terrified children hiding in a corner. Without hesitation, he ran towards them, with Alejandro and Carlos close behind. "It's okay," said Matteo Lorenzo in Spanish, his voice soft and reassuring. "We've come to help. You're safe now." While Matteo calmed the children, Alejandro and Carlos secured the area. It was then that Alejandro noticed a suspicious movement. "Carlos, look out!" he shouted, pushing his friend aside just in time to avoid being shot. The ensuing confrontation was brief, but intense. When the dust settled, the complex was secure, dozens of traffickers had been arrested, and more than 100 children were safe. Hours later, while the rescued children were being examined and cared for, Alejandro found Matteo Lorenzo sitting quietly in a corner, observing everything. "You were amazing today," said Alejandro, sitting down next to his son. Matteo Lorenzo smiled tiredly. "We all were, Dad, but looking at these children, I know we still have a lot of work to do." Alejandro nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility and the satisfaction of duty done. "One step at a time, son. Together, we'll make a difference." As the sun rose over Bogotá, illuminating the start of a new day, Alejandro, Matteo Lorenzo, and Carlos watched the rescued children being reunited with their families. Tears, hugs, and smiles lit up the place. It was a powerful reminder of why they did it, why they risked their lives. And although they knew the fight was far from over, at that moment, they felt the sweet satisfaction of a battle won and lives transformed. The Morales Bianchi Foundation had taken a big step, but it was only the beginning of a much bigger journey. A journey of hope, redemption, and the unbreakable power of family love. 5 years had passed since the successful operation in Colombia. The Morales Bianchi Foundation had become a global force in the fight against child trafficking, with offices in 12 countries and a reputation for excellence and unwavering dedication. Alejandro, now 70, watched the sunset from his balcony in Buenos Aires. His hair was completely grey, but his eyes still shone with the same determination as ever. Next to him, Matteo Lorenzo, now 35, held a cup of mate. "Dad," said Matteo Lorenzo, breaking the comfortable silence, "have you ever thought about retiring?" Alejandro laughed softly. "Retire? And leave all the fun to you?" Matteo Lorenzo smiled, but his expression soon turned serious. "It's just that, after everything we've been through, everything we've achieved, you deserve a rest." Alejandro put his hand on his son's shoulder. "My rest, Matteo, is seeing the good we're doing, seeing families reunited, children saved. I can't imagine a better life than this." At that moment, Carlos, now with grey hair at his temples, but still as imposing as ever, entered the balcony. "Gentlemen," he said, "we have an important call. It's from the UN." The 3 men went to Alejandro's office, where a video conference was set up. On the screen appeared the face of a middle-aged woman with a warm smile. "Mr. Morales, Mr. Lorenzo," she greeted. "I'm Elena Rodriguez from the UN Human Rights Division. We're getting in touch because we want to propose a global partnership with the Morales Bianchi Foundation." Alejandro and Matteo Lorenzo exchanged surprised glances. Elena continued, "Your work in recent years has been extraordinary. We believe that, with the UN's resources and your expertise, we can create a worldwide program to combat child trafficking." The proposal was ambitious, a global initiative that would combine the efforts of the Morales Bianchi Foundation with the resources and diplomatic influence of the UN. It would be the largest effort ever made to combat child trafficking on a global scale. After the call, Alejandro, Matteo Lorenzo, and Carlos sat in silence for a few moments, absorbing the magnitude of the opportunity. "This is bigger than anything we've ever done," said Matteo Lorenzo, his voice mixing excitement and apprehension. Carlos nodded. "The challenges will be enormous, but the potential impact—" Alejandro stood up, walking over to the window. He thought about his journey, from the day Matteo disappeared to this moment. Every tear, every sleepless night, every battle faced, everything had led to this. "Let's do it," he said, turning to face his son and his most loyal friend. "It's time to take our mission to the next level." The following months were a whirlwind of activity. The partnership with the UN, required a massive restructuring of the foundation. New teams were formed, protocols were established, and a global cooperation network began to take shape. Alejandro led the diplomatic negotiations, using his business experience to navigate the complexities of international politics. Matteo Lorenzo oversaw the expansion of psychological support and reintegration programs, ensuring that every rescued child received the care they needed. Carlos, for his part, coordinated a global training program for rescue teams, sharing his vast experience in security and tactical operations. A year after the partnership began, the global initiative was ready to be launched. A press conference was organized at the UN headquarters in New York, with world leaders, activists, and survivors of child trafficking in attendance. On the morning of the conference, Alejandro found Matteo Lorenzo nervously adjusting his tie in front of the mirror. "Nervous?" asked Alejandro. Matteo Lorenzo smiled shyly. "A little. It's a huge responsibility." Alejandro hugged his son. "Remember why we're doing this, for every child we've already saved, and for all those we're still going to save." As they took to the stage, the lights from the cameras momentarily blinded them. Alejandro felt the weight of millions of eyes on him, but when he looked at Matteo Lorenzo and Carlos, who were standing next to him, he felt strengthened. 25 years ago, Alejandro began, his voice firm, "I lost my son to child trafficking. I spent 2 decades looking for him, and when I finally found him, we promised that we would do everything in our power to make sure that no other family went through what we did." He paused, looking out at the audience. "Today, we're not just launching an initiative, we are declaring war on child trafficking on a global scale. With the partnership between the Morales Bianchi Foundation and the United Nations, we are sending a clear message: we will not rest until every child is safe, until every separated family is reunited." Matteo Lorenzo then took the floor, his voice laden with emotion. "As a child who has been trafficked, I know firsthand the trauma and pain that these experiences cause, but I also know the power of hope and human resilience. Our mission is not just to rescue, but to heal, support, and empower." As the conference continued, detailing the plans and objectives of the global initiative, Alejandro couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey that had brought him there. From a desperate father to a leader of a global mission, his life had been transformed in ways he could never have imagined. At the end of the conference, as the applause echoed through the hall, Alejandro, Matteo Lorenzo, and Carlos came together in an emotional embrace. They knew that the road ahead would be challenging, that there would be obstacles and difficulties, but they also knew that together they could make a difference. That evening, back at the hotel, Alejandro found a moment of stillness. Looking out of the window at the lights of New York, he thought of all the children who still needed help, all the families who were still waiting for answers. "We'll keep fighting," he muttered to himself, "for each and every one of them." And so, with a heart full of hope and renewed determination, Alejandro Morales prepared for the next chapter of his mission, a mission that had begun with the search for a lost son and was now expanding to embrace the whole world, a legacy of hope, built on the love of a father, the courage of a son, and the loyalty of a friend, a legacy that would continue to inspire and transform lives for generations to come.